All right, the president there, we were listening to see if he would take that question on Iran. The president, very angry about this Supreme Court decision, striking down his biggest tariffs, really, the ones I think that are most define his policy, that are so important to him. He is so mad. He is insulting the Supreme Court justices who supported them with specifically harsh words for those justices he appointed and for those appointed by Republican presidents. Well, on the flip side, trying to put a shine on this and say that actually this makes things crystal clear, and now he can actually collect more money in the form of tariffs using other statutes that he has plans to begin doing today. So it's a really interesting approach that he has here, Boris.
No doubt. The president there getting personal with members of the Supreme Court in ways that historically we haven't seen. I'm not a historian, but I did some cursory research, and you've had previous presidents, Thomas Jefferson, FDR, and others, who've been critical about decisions that the court has made. But we just heard the president of the United States say that justices that he nominated to the court and were confirmed should be ashamed of themselves, that their families should be ashamed of themselves. The president also, as you said, sort of trying to flip this decision to say that now there's certainty in the U.S. economy, that the court confirmed that he could put tariffs in the economy, which is not really what the court decided here. Lastly, as you said, the president installing this immediate 10% tariff on all countries around the world. Let's go to Kristen Holmes, who was in that briefing, and try to get a question in. The president had some negative words for our network, Kristen, but nevertheless, he was angry today.
Yeah, he is clearly angry. He's been seething about this decision. This is the real core tenet of not just his economic agenda, but really his foreign policy agenda as well. He has used these tariffs as leverage, and he said specifically, yes, he is going this alternative route. Yes, he is going to be invoking this 10% global tariffs by using the Section 122. We know that they are looking into also using Section 301. Those are the things, those trade law that they're talking about to get this done. But that being said, the reason that they had gone this route initially was because this was quicker. They wanted this to be done quicker. They wanted to be able to instate this quicker. And that is why you're seeing this frustration from President Trump. There were other alternatives. You clearly saw him laying them out there, but he just wanted this to be done with. And I will say there was several interesting things he said. One, he was asked specifically about the two justices that he appointed to the Supreme Court. The question that I had also tried to ask, which is whether or not he regretted it. He wouldn't answer that, but he said it was an embarrassment. This decision to rule against the tariffs was an embarrassment to their families. We know that he has ranted in the past about Supreme Court justices, particularly those he has appointed who don't rule in his favor. But it was very clear here today that he was incredibly angry. He was angry at the court. He was angry at the people that he put into place. And he said so much, saying that they should be ashamed of themselves and of this decision that they made. Now, one of the things we also saw him do was walk through the dissent from Kavanaugh, who obviously ruled in favor of keeping the tariffs or against them being illegal, and said that Kavanaugh had sort of set up a roadmap for what they were going to be doing now to instate these tariffs, and praised Kavanaugh as well, also mentioning that all of the Supreme Court justices are still invited to the State of the Union, but barely. But again, you could see how angry he was. This is a core part of what they do, what he has been doing, both in terms of economic policy, paying for different programs, saying that these tariffs are going to various different programs and bailouts, as well as when he goes into meetings with these foreign leaders, using the tariffs as an enormous amount of leverage, and really doing so carte blanche until now.
Kristen, stand by for us if you would. Joan, I just want to get some clarity on something that Kristen brought up there. I mean, from my reading of this, Kavanaugh provides a roadmap on the ways in which Trump could use his other means to have his tariff policies, as much as he provides a roadmap on whether these tariff collections are going to be repaid. How is that being understood about how clear this decision is about that?
Okay. Justice Kavanaugh, who dissented, he was one of the three dissenters, indeed gave a blueprint for potentially going forward. And President Trump does have things he can do. But the majority what controls here, specifically said, referring to Justice Kavanaugh's writing in this opinion, those statutes that were cited contain various combinations of procedural requirements, agency determinations, and limits on duration and amount. We do not speculate on any hypothetical cases not before us. So, of course, the president's going to put a positive gloss on this. What struck me is the vitriol that he has leveled at lower court judges so much that he now has brought to the Supreme Court justices. So I think you're exactly right to say he wants it both ways. But here what he's trying to do is to say, I hate them. They're terrible. They're the losers that I've said the lower court judges are, but they've given me a window. Yes, of course he has a window. He's always had that window. He's always had alternative means. It's just that he cannot go it alone.
A disgrace to our nation, against the loyalty of our people, fools, lapdogs, very unpatriotic. How does the court read these comments?
Okay, I'm sure they do not have their TVs on now. I mean, the justices won't. The justices probably expected some of this. And in some ways, for Chief Justice John Roberts, who certainly is aware of the narrative that he is in lockstep with President Trump, he probably doesn't mind that kind of criticism. But what he probably really minds is the fact that so many of these judges nationwide, I'm not just talking about the 9 Supreme Court justices, but so many of these judges have been under threat. And to what all of you have just mentioned, the thing about embarrassment to their families, Justice Amy Coney Barrett's family has already been sent the pizzas that a lot of people have been sent. I mean, there are threats against many members of the judiciary. And what Donald Trump said today must exacerbate the concerns that the Chief Justice John Roberts and his colleagues would feel about that. Presidents have been mad about rulings. I mean, I was reminded of the 1952 steel seizure ruling where some of President Truman's appointees ruled against him in terms of privately trying to get steel during the Korean War. And Truman was furious, but he would have never done something like this. No other president would have said what he's saying here.
Yeah, Paula, this comment that he's making about how there's great certainty that has been brought back, it's perhaps a hard argument to accept considering how upset he is about the decision. If he were thrilled about the great certainty, he wouldn't be so ticked off, one would think.
Yeah.